The Phantom Flight. It was a moonless night, and the sky was as black as the void of space. Flight 717, a mid-sized commercial airliner, had taken off from a coastal city bound for a distant metropolis. Few passengers were on board, making the environment quiet and slightly uncomfortable. The sound of the engine and the intermittent warnings on the dashboard were the only soundtrack on the trip. In the cockpit, Captain Smith and co-pilot Taylor were calm. The weather was clear, and the route seemed promising an uneventful crossing. Smith was an experienced pilot with decades of experience, while Taylor, although younger, demonstrated competence and professionalism. In the cabin, flight attendants moved among the passengers, serving drinks and adjusting their comfort. Everything seemed normal until, shortly after midnight, the communication system failed. The radios began to emit static, and communication with the tower was lost. Smith tried several times to re-establish contact, but all he could hear were hissing sounds mixed with a faint, incomprehensible voice, as if someone were trying to transmit a message from far away. Irritated, he asked Taylor to check the systems. No apparent technical faults were found. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, the first signs of something strange began to emerge. A child sitting next to the window pointed outside and called to his mother, saying he had seen another plane flying nearby. The confused mother looked outside but saw nothing but darkness. However, the child persisted, describing an old plane with propellers that seemed to be very close. Soon, other passengers began to report unusual sensations. One woman claimed to have felt a cold draft pass by her, even though all the doors and windows were sealed. A man who had been dozing woke up with a start, saying he had heard whispers coming from the back of the cabin. Smith, unaware of what was happening in the cabin, was concentrating on keeping the plane on course, but something caught his attention. On the radar, a dot appeared, moving erratically. It was the only object in radar range, but it seemed to be approaching quickly. "It must be a glitch," Smith said, trying to reassure Taylor. But before he could finish his sentence, the cabin lights flickered and the plane gave a slight jolt, as if it had hit turbulence. At that moment, the cockpit door opened by itself. Smith turned quickly and found the chief flight attendant, but something was wrong with her. Her face was pale, and her eyes seemed glassy. She spoke in a voice that did not sound like hers. "They're here." Smith and Taylor stood still. The flight attendant, without waiting for an answer, turned around and left. Smith ordered Taylor to follow her, but when he opened the passenger cabin door, he froze. The light was flickering, and the environment seemed shrouded in a haze that made no sense inside an airplane. The passengers were restless, some standing up, looking around as if sensing something invisible. A figure appeared in the back of the cabin, indistinct but clearly present. It was tall and slender, its silhouette blurred, like a blur against the fog. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with incomprehensible words, and the atmosphere became unbearably cold. Taylor retreated to the cockpit, locking the door. Smith barely managed to ask what had happened before the lights went out completely. The plane plunged into total darkness, except for the instruments on the panel, which were flashing frantically. "The radar," Smith said, her voice shaking. "The dot is inside us." Suddenly, a female voice echoed over the cabin's PA system, although no one had activated the microphone. The voice was calm, but it carried a hint of menace. "You have invaded our space. Pay the price." Before Smith could react, the plane began to shake violently. The windows frosted over, and a collective scream filled the cabin. Smith tried to regain control, but all systems were down. The last thing he saw was a spectral shape crossing the cockpit panel before he lost consciousness completely. When Smith opened his eyes, the plane was sitting on an abandoned runway surrounded by dense forest. The sun was rising over the horizon, but the cabin was empty. All the passengers, flight attendants, and even Taylor had disappeared. Only the distant echo of whispers remained, a reminder that Flight 717 should never have crossed that sky. The passenger in seat 13B. Atlantic Airways Flight 249 took off from London to New York on a stormy night. Dark clouds seemed to engulf the plane while lightning lit up the sky like camera flashes. Despite the weather, the passengers tried to relax, immersed in their headphones, books, or naps, while the crew maintained a calm demeanor. However, something was out of the ordinary. Seat 13B, located in the middle of the plane, caught the eye. The seat was occupied by a tall, thin man wearing an impeccable black suit. His skin was pale, and he wore sunglasses, even inside the plane. He didn't move, didn't speak, and didn't seem to interact with anyone. He just stared straight ahead, as if he wasn't present in the same plane as the others. Flight attendant Emily noticed his strange behavior and tried to approach him to offer him something. "Sir, would you like a drink or something to eat?" she asked with a forced smile. The man slowly turned his head toward her, but said nothing. After a few seconds of awkward silence, he simply raised his hand, as if to ask her to move away. Confused and slightly uncomfortable, Emily returned to her work, but she couldn't get the passenger out of her head. Throughout the flight, unexplained events began to occur. The cabin lights flickered several times, and the entertainment system was interrupted by static, followed by whispers. Some passengers reported feeling a strange presence, as if someone were standing next to them, even though no one was there. A woman in the back of the plane began to cry softly, claiming that she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. Emily, worried, returned to the cockpit to report the incidents to Captain Johnson and co-pilot Miller. Johnson tried to reassure her, saying that thunderstorms could cause minor electrical failures. But Emily knew there was something more. Before leaving, she mentioned the passenger in 13B. "There is no 13B on this flight," Miller said, consulting the seat map. Number 13 was omitted out of superstition. "That seat doesn't exist." Emily froze. She was sure of what she saw. She decided to go back to the cabin to check, but when she arrived, the man was no longer there. The seat was empty, as if no one had occupied that seat. She asked the passengers around her, but they all denied having seen him. Some even looked at her as if she were crazy. The night got even stranger. The pilot reported that the plane was off its planned route, even though all the instruments indicated that they were on the correct course. In addition, the altitude seemed to fluctuate, as if the plane was being pulled by invisible forces. Around 2 in the morning, Emily heard a sound coming from the cargo area. It was a metallic sound, as if something was being dragged. She called one of her colleagues, but he refused to go with her, saying that the situation was already strange enough. Determined, she went alone. In the cargo compartment, the air was cold and heavy. She found several boxes knocked over and, on the floor, scratch marks that formed a strange pattern, like overlapping circles. In the center of the marks was something even more disturbing, the same man from 13B, standing and staring at her. His eyes, now visible behind his glasses, were completely black, like 2 holes in space. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice sounding like it was coming from everywhere at once. Emily tried to run, but something invisible held her back. The man raised his hand, and the temperature dropped even further. She felt her breath hitch, and in an instant, everything went dark. When Emily woke up, she was in the main cabin, surrounded by the passengers. Everyone seemed in shock. Captain Johnson announced that they had landed safely in New York, but no one seemed relieved. Something was wrong. As she stepped off the plane, Emily looked at the passenger manifest handed out by the ground crew. There was no record of anyone in seat 13B, nor in 13A or 13C, which were also empty. When he asked the captain about the incident, he simply shook his head, as if he preferred not to talk about it. The next day, news of a plane crash made headlines. A flight from another airline, which was supposed to have followed the same route, disappeared over the Atlantic that same night. There were no survivors. Ever since, it has been said that the passenger in 13B has been on the scene to divert planes away from imminent disasters, but always at a price.